This campaign at this stage is firing on all cylinders. And as a result, ISIL is under more pressure than ever before.
Unfortunately, despite all our progress against ISIL on the battlefield and in the financial realm, our efforts have not reduced the group's terrorism capability and global reach.
President Obama and his CIA director with very different assessments of the threat from ISIS in the wake of the Orlando terror attack. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, Amy Walter from the Cook Political Report, syndicated columnist George Will, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Well, Brit, that was a pretty stunning contradiction. On Tuesday, you had the president talking about making significant progress against ISIS, and then the very next day you had the CIA director testifying before Congress saying, yeah, we are rolling back some of their territory, yeah, we are killing some of their people, but in fact they're a greater threat than ever to the West.
So obviously what the CIA director is saying is that this policy and practice that the administration has put into place against ISIS is not working. The threat is growing. The president would never say that. I don't think Brennan's going to get fired, but you put that together with all of this argument about the use of the term, radical Islamic terrorism, or the refusal to use it by the administration. This is a point of vulnerability for the administration at a moment when the president's approval rating had been rising, which is of inestimable help to his party's candidate, in this case Hillary Clinton. But this attack, I think, is for the time being anyway, a game changer on that, and has thrown the administration on the defensive, and the Brennan testimony hammers that home.
We're going to get to the political aspects of this in the next segment, but let's talk about the substance of what we do. Juan, for all the talk about immigration and gun control, and we'll get to those in a moment, isn't the best way to stop the terror attacks to win the war against ISIS?
Well, I think that's part of the answer. I mean, clearly, if you diminish the leadership, and the United States has been killing off a great number of the leaders of the terror groups, and you cut in terms of their territory. This week we saw them pushed out of Fallujah, for example. So there's progress there on the battlefield. The problem is that they are now relying on alternative strategies. So they're, for example, expanding their presence in places like Nigeria and Libya, so they're a bigger presence there. And secondly, relying on social media to spread their cancerous ideology. So that's an issue there. And they're also now saying, excuse me, that they can rely on infiltrating refugee flows and these lone wolf attacks. So this is a different set of issues. I mean, you can wipe them out in terms of their presence in Syria, Iraq, but the presence in Africa, the presence on social media, the threat in terms of the refugee flows, that remains, even if you beat them on the battlefield.
Well, we'd like to know what would happen if they were beaten on the battlefield. And the fact is, although gains have been made, they have not been beaten. Their territory, their headquarters in Raqqa remains secure, so far as we can tell. So the question that's raised by all of this is, how inspired would Omar Mateen have been if the image of ISIS was not that of a winner whose power is growing, but of a loser whose defeat is inevitable and coming soon?
Well, I think that they know that the defeat's on the way, Britt, because, in fact, what they're saying to people is don't come into the battlefield anymore because, guess what, we're losing. Instead, engage in these lone wolf attacks.
Let me turn to another aspect of this, because as usual in the wake of a mass shooting, we talk about guns, George, and the debate here in Washington that they're going to vote up in that building behind me on Monday on 4 proposals on gun control. Moderate Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine is proposing a compromise that would bar people not on the terror watch list, which, as we say, has 800,000 people, but on 2 smaller, more targeted lists from buying guns. Does that make any sense, and do you think there's any chance that Congress will pass it?
Well, here's the problem. We have a list of lists now. You've demonstrated in your questions to the Attorney General that the watch list is cumbersome, too large to be meaningful, and doesn't have much consequence. To put someone on the selectee list, that is, you can't buy a gun if you're on the selectee list, all that means is you're on that list, you get exposed to more rigorous examination when you try to board an airplane. Well,
you're selected out for special security.
That's right, but you would be attaching to that status the loss of a constitutional right, which we've now established under the Heller decision, is the right to buy a gun. if you're on the no-fly list, you've already lost a fundamental constitutional right, the right to travel. So that they raise different due process questions. But when you start changing people's rights, all kinds of panoply of due process comes in, and it gets complicated. Now, people are saying, no, this man in Orlando was very odd, lots of indications of instability and danger. Something should have been done, but it's not clear what that something can be, again, under a constitutional society with a rule of law. I think the average American says, when they hear these proposals, how would it have prevented the most recent outrage? And it's not clear that it would have had any effect on this at all. And a lot of Americans, when the subject becomes assault weapons, what they describe as assault weapon is really a machine gun, which of course has been banned in this country for 82 years, since 1934. That is a gun in which a single pull of the trigger will result in a constant flow of bullets. So there's an enormous amount of confusion and enormous separation between the perceived dangers and the effect of any proposal we're hearing.
Let's bring in the panel, because we ask you for questions for the panel here. And we got an interesting question from Mark Baker on Facebook. He writes, a terrorist without an AR-15 is still capable of mass murder. An AR-15 without a terrorist is not. Why does the administration choose to focus on this one variable and not the one common denominator? Amy, how do you answer Mark? And you know, it's so interesting because on the one hand, you had Attorney General Lynch saying, look, give due process, give them time. She's saying kind of an unlimited due process. Then you get Republicans saying, well, give them 72 hours. Wouldn't you think there'd be the ability to find something in the middle there?
Wouldn't that be amazing? And I think that the person who wrote in is suggesting that too. But we live in a world right now where partisanship defines policy. And so when you look at how do Americans feel about what happened in Orlando, if you're a Democrat, you think this is about guns. If you're a Republican, overwhelmingly, you think this is about terrorism. And these two things are not meeting anywhere in the middle. Gallup went out and asked, how do we prevent another Orlando? And what a majority of Americans, overwhelming majority, said, do something about guns. The Muslim ban, very, very far down on the list of how this would prevent another Orlando. I went back and I looked at the last time that we had compromise on a gun legislation. Back in the Clinton era, the 1994 assault weapons ban. Back then, you had 38 Republicans that voted for it in the House. You had 77 Democrats voting against it. That era doesn't exist anymore. This idea that you could have moderate Republicans, conservative Democrats, and they could come up with a compromise, those people are gone. And the only people left in Congress are people who believe in the partisanship and the ideology that drives their party.
One more thing, Brit. I want to go back to CIA Director Brennan's warning that as they're losing territory, that ISIS is focusing more on foreign attacks, and he specifically talked about using the flow of refugees into the West. In a sense, doesn't that track with what Donald Trump has been saying? It
does, and it illustrates that why Trump rings a bell with so many people on that issue. You know, it's been a paradox of this primary season, Chris, that in the polling that was done in state after state among Republican voters, immigration was ranked very low. But there's no other way to look at Trump's success without concluding that his stand on immigration, which I think in a lot of people's minds kind of blends into limiting all immigration, legal and illegal, has been a winner for him and may continue to be if you know, this process goes on. If, as he says, there are more of these attacks, as he says there will be, I think that helps him.
Well, that's what's interesting is that the issue of immigration was very low, and yet an overwhelming majority of Republicans supported the ban on Muslims coming into the country. So they were calling it, in their own mind, they don't think of that as immigration.
No.
But
No,
it is an issue of immigration.
Terrorism.
Exactly.
All right, we have to take a break here.